Good morning. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Mom's Life. So glad to see you here this morning. It's a weird little week because, well, fall break, right? So a lot of people aren't here because their kids are in fall break, whether it's school or preschool. So we have a little bit of a smaller room this morning, but I'm so happy all of you could make it. Welcome. A couple of announcements for you today. Just a reminder, because of fall break, we will not be here next week. So no Mom's Life next week. I mean, you could still come, but there won't be any food or people. So anyway, I'll be here. I'll be working in my office, but yeah, that'll be it. So don't come next week. And then we will be back here again the following week, which is Halloween, the 31st. We'll be here on the 31st. We'll be back. And just a reminder, too, today, Tim is our speaker. We haven't even gotten our food yet. We'll get to that. But the notes are in the app. So we've got some notes today and information. There are some handouts on the table, but they're always in the app. And you can even take notes in the app. I don't know if everybody knew that. So if you like to jot down something that you heard that you want to remember, you can do that either on the paper or in the app. So just a reminder, that's there. If you need help finding it, just let me know. I'm happy to help you find it. And I'm going to go ahead and pray for our food, and then we have a special announcement. So I'm going to pray. Oh, Lord, thank you. Thank you for today. Thank you that we could come together in your name and just enjoy time and delicious food and warm drinks together. I just pray for all of our friends who couldn't be here today, whether they're traveling or sick or whatever else is going on in their lives. Would you just be with them and help them to be able to come back next time? And Lord, I just pray that you would be here in this place this morning, and we just give you all the glory in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, before we get our food, we have a special announcement from Amy Christie, pastor of Community Life.
Thanks, Kara. So today, Tim's going to speak to you about the life of Joseph, which is one of the most fascinating stories, maybe in all of Scripture, but definitely in the Old Testament. And going along with Tim's speech today, just kidding, it's not going along with it, but we are doing Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat at Grace this fall. And I just wanted to promote this to you because there is nowhere in town that you can get a ticket to a musical for $16. And I am a pastor at Grace, but one of my degrees is in musical theater. So I do know kind of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these shows and directing them. And it is, it tells the entire story of Joseph in song and dance. So it is good for all ages. You will be able to talk to your kids about this story after you see the show. And it is a fascinating story of forgiveness and redemption and God being with you through all of the trials that you go through to figure out who God created you to be and live into that destiny. And the whole show with intermission is under 2 hours. There's hardly a musical in the world that you can see that is that short. And I just wanted to say, get your tickets. It's going to be so much fun. I hope to see you there. And after you hear Tim speak about this story today, that should pique your interest to see what they do with this musical. Andrew Lloyd Webber's dad was a minister, so it's accurate. It is the story to song and dance. So you can pick up a flyer on your way out. It is November 8, 9, 10, and 15, 16, 17. And after you hear this story today, you're going to want to see it played out in song and dance. So we'd love to have you there. And bring friends and your family. Yay. Thank you.
Yay, good. It's so exciting. And you know she's the director. She said that. Yeah. Okay. Also, I forgot one other thing. We have a lost and found item. There's a cute pink bag that has been here for a couple weeks. If that's yours, you can take it home. If not, it will be here next week. Okay, we need to eat, so let's have food. I think there's still some more coming, right? Is there? Oh, okay, we're here. Everything's here. Okay, let's have food, so please enjoy. Good morning again. Sorry to interrupt your good conversation this morning and breakfast. We are ready to get started, and I apologize. We're running a little bit behind today, but I'm sure it will be fine. We have already prayed, and we've talked about Joseph coming, and we're going to learn more about Joseph of the Old Testament and Genesis today. And I want to introduce our speaker for today, Tim Ayers. Tim is a teaching pastor here at Grace. And you guys, I know a lot of you don't attend Grace, and you haven't been, I don't know if you've ever been to any of our services here, but you come to Mom's Life, so thank you. So you may not know Tim. He has taught at Real Mom's Life several times. But, you know, Tim has been here at Grace since the beginning. He came with a group from Faith Church who planted Grace in the 90s. And Tim was not originally a pastor at that time, but he came to join staff at Grace and went to seminary and has been teaching for many years here at Grace. Tim and his wife, Jennifer, have been a blessing and a gift to us. So thank you, Tim, for being here. They have 3 kids of their own, Jacob, Emily, and Elizabeth, and 9 grandkids, I believe. Is that right? Yeah, 9. And they all live in Illinois, Colorado, California. Yeah. Did I get that right? And you guys, Tim is retiring soon at the end of this year, December.
Wait, what did I just hear? Did I hear boos or cheers? It's okay, but boos.
And so I asked if he would come and teach before he retires, and maybe in the future, I'm hopeful, maybe, but they get to travel a lot and visit family and that kind of thing. So it is a real gift for Tim to be here with us today, and I'm just looking forward to it. And thank you, Tim, so much. Can we thank him and appreciate him? Thank you.
How long am I supposed to talk?
Like 30 to 35 minutes.
What? You can stand one person talking for 35 minutes? You know, the rule is now in churches 15 minutes, that if your sermon is longer than 15 minutes, nobody's listening. Well, that doesn't apply for me? Okay. I was asked to speak to you about Joseph. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to say this because this is one of the funniest moments of my life as a pastor, but a person who was on staff at the time working with our teenagers came up to me after a sermon that I'd given on Joseph, and he said, "I'm so glad that we have the story of Jesus' dad in the Old Testament." What? And he says, "Because now we know what kind of man raised Jesus." And I stood there for a minute. First off, I was incredulous because this guy was teaching our high school kid. And I said, "Oh, no, wrong dude." Yeah, Jesus' dad was named after this guy. And it's only about 3,000 years difference. Anyway, but I just say, I am talking about Joseph. And now you know the reason Amy came and talked to you, because they're doing Joseph and what is it? The Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? Is that what it's called? Okay. I'm going to have to talk to you about that, but we'll get to it. Pardon? Oh, guys, my job is to burst bubbles. But I'll start by saying that if you've seen it, have any of you, I've never seen it. Can I just be really honest? Back when they wrote it, and they wrote Jesus Christ Superstar, and Andrew Lloyd Webber, that was like I was a rock and roll musician. That's what I did. And it was like, that's not cool to take rock and roll and turn it into a musical. So I never saw it out of pure protest. So I will be seeing it for the first time this year. So anyway, but I want you to know that the outline of the story, that if you go, is pretty much right straight out of the Bible. It doesn't deviate from the scripture much at all. Now, all the dialogue and the words to the songs and the stuff they do, all that stuff comes right out of Tim Rice's mind and Andrew Lloyd Webber, who wrote the music. But the storyline isn't really embellished at all. And what I was asked to do, because what happened was where is Kara? I was talking to her after a staff meeting about something about Joseph, and I was telling her where something in the story was completely false. And she said, "Oh, come and tell our ladies about that." So I was asked to come and tell you where the real story differs from the musical, but also, I have to say, the real story is different from what we've come to believe about Joseph over the centuries, because the story has become part of our spiritual heritage. Does that make sense? It's just one of those stories that we know about. It's a quarter of the book of Genesis, and it is the big narrative in the book of Genesis. And so when we learn it as kids, because if you grew up in a church, you always run into Joseph well, I still call it Sunday school. I'm so old that I call it Sunday school. But we still learn it there, and you can't really go into the big details about it or some of the other stuff that's in the text that is, and if you know this idea, there are things that when the Bible was written that they didn't have to tell us because everybody knew about that stuff. And this is common. It's just like if I say to you that the entire Lucas Oil Stadium was blue last Sunday, you know that I'm talking about everybody who's wearing a blue outfit because the Colts are blue, their color is blue. But if you're from New Orleans, you might think that everybody was sad. They had the blues because something happened there that everybody was sad. You see, but if they write about the Colts and having a blue stadium in the paper, they don't have to go, the Colts are a football team, and their color is blue. And do you see what I'm saying? And there's so much of that in the Bible that's behind everything. And Joseph's story has tons and tons of stuff in it that the writer of Genesis, who I think was Moses himself, but the writer of Genesis didn't have to include because all of those first people who read it, and the first people who read Genesis were the people who had been released from slavery in Egypt. Is this making sense? Moses was writing to people who understood all that background stuff, and he didn't have to include it. And now, thousands of years later, we don't know any of that stuff unless we're some of those egghead people like me who spend their whole life studying that stuff from historical works and archaeological works. You see what I mean? Or even the meanings of the ancient languages. And so if I ever get off of this part of this talk, I'll get to the subject and we'll talk about things like that. But I want you to know that the Jews initially believed that Joseph was a character who bookended, now follow me on this, the book of Genesis. There are all kinds of really complicated literary things going on in the book of Genesis. Do you guys know the thing, it's called the Bible Project? If you ever want to know about that stuff, they talk about it in depth in the two things that they have. They have two different 45-minute long podcasts about this book, about Genesis in particular, about Joseph's story, and they talk about all the literary things, but the vast majority of the way that the Jews talked about this story is that here you start with Adam, and Adam is born into a perfect place, and he makes a bad decision, or he makes bad decisions, he fails God, and his disobedience creates all kinds of problems for the whole world. You see that? That's what Adam does. Now, he's the bookend at the beginning. Then you have Joseph at the end, and as we'll see, Joseph was born into really complicated, difficult circumstances, and he makes the right decisions that God would want him to make, and what he ends up doing is he saves his own people, and by extension he saves Judah, who is what? The father of the family that gives us Jesus. And so you've got one guy at the beginning who screws up, and another guy at the end who doesn't. This guy ruins the world for everybody, and this guy saves the whole world by being the one who obeys. So that's the way the Jews primarily looked at this book, okay? That we've got an example of what not to do and an example of what to do. But Joseph is he's never been considered by the Jews as a Messiah figure. Their idea of the Messiah is way different than who Jesus was. Their expectations of a Messiah was way different, still are, way different from Joseph. Because Joseph isn't a warrior. He's not a fighter who leads an army. He's not. The Jews are always looking for somebody who's going to come and be violent in the world and overthrow all of the powers that rule over them. They're not looking for a Joseph who's actually fairly peaceful throughout his. But he was not a Messiah. But that said, Joseph's obedience does make it possible for him to be the savior of the person who does bring us the Messiah. So that's an important distinction. And I'm just going to say that there are some, this is probably a book if anyone want to write it, connections. I've never seen it, but there are tons of connections between who Joseph was and how his life was lived out and Jesus' life. And interestingly, the Jews' title for Joseph in a lot of the rabbinical midrashes or statements that they write about, or things they write about it, is that he was the suffering servant. Now, that is a term we use for Jesus. We do. But they call him the suffering servant. So there are some big connections there, but he's not seen as the Messiah figure. Okay, I'm going to start by reading, and we're going to put this up. Is that right? Okay, it starts out, this is the account of Jacob and his family, and the reason it's stated that way, and all we're going to talk about is Joseph, is because this is about the generations of Jacob, his family, and what happens to them. But it starts out by saying, this is the account of Jacob. And when Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers and sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. I don't think anybody uses those names anymore, do they? But anyway, first off, when it says he was 17 years old, we do actually get that number in the Hebrew, and then it uses a word to describe him, the word is nayar in the Hebrew, and it can refer to a young man, but it really is generally used to mean an assistant or an adolescent servant. And so it says he was 17, and when it says he often tended, that word is he was a nayar to his father's flocks, which means that's an important detail because it meant he didn't have any responsibility or anything. He just did what people told him. And the other thing that's really important to keep in mind that when it says he worked for the half-brothers is not in there. It just says brothers. And it says the sons of his wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. Do you know the story of how those women became? They are not the wives of Jacob. They are the handmaidens of Jacob's wives. You remember the story? They couldn't get pregnant, and so they had Jacob make babies with their servants, and you end up in the end with 4 women with all these children, almost all boys. They had one girl, and they have all these boys, and they did not get along. And can you imagine just the complicated nature of a family when the 2 of the servants of the wives of the patriarch have more children than the women who are actually wives, and they didn't. And the reason they had these children with the servants was because they were getting back at each other. Can you imagine the family problems? And here is Jacob, who is the next to youngest kid, who is a late birth child to Rachel, who was the favorite, the one that Jacob, I don't know if you know the story, but he worked for his father-in-law for 14 years to get to marry her. He loved her so much, and after 7 years, the father snuck the other sister into the bedroom on their wedding night, and he got her pregnant and didn't even know he was with the wrong girl. Now, well, that's another story, but can you imagine all of the problems in that family? And they have what? Jacob is working for the 4 brothers of the handmaidens. We got a bad family problem here, okay? And so you got to keep that in mind. We tend to think about the families in the Bible as being examples of what should happen, and I can tell you that every family in Genesis from Adam on down is an example of what we should not do. Okay? And this one is no different. And I got too many notes here, I'm trying to say. I will say this. I want to tell you this, though. When it says he was 17 years old and he often tended his father's flock. Now, some of you know this, but I had a slight hand. I mean, so slight that it's like a blip on the radar screen in the translation of the NLT, which our church uses. And oftentimes, I didn't have anything to do with the Old Testament. What were they thinking when they put it there? Because the word is interesting. The Hebrew actually reads like this. Joseph, 17 years old, was shepherding his brothers, the sons of... Now, that's not the same thing. And what it is it's a foreshadowing in the language that even though he is a Nayar, even though he is 17, even though he is just working for the main shepherds in his family, this foreshadows us that someday he will be what? Shepherding his brothers. The boss. It's right there in the first verse. And when they first read it, the first readers would have gone, I see something in that. It goes on, it says, but Joseph reported to his father some bad things that his brothers were doing. Okay, the brothers are Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, the sons of the handmaidens. What it says in the Hebrew is that he brought a dibah. A dibah is... it's not a very often used word in the Old Testament, but it means a whispering, gossipy, bad report about someone. The main other place, do you know the story of when the Jews were about to go in to the Promised Land and they sent some spies in to look around and to see what it was like? And they came back and they said, everybody in there's a giant, but we can beat him. Well, the word that starts out, the word that says when all the people murmured and didn't want to go in and they started fussing about it and all this, they started a dibah. That's the other place that it's really used. What this tells us is this, that Joseph was a tattletale, a behind the back to his father tattletale, no less. Now, we don't know what the bad report was. And was Joseph probably right about it? I guess he could have probably been right, that his brothers were up to no good. I mean, they were the 4 brothers by the handmaidens. They weren't the real sons of the real wives. But I would just have to say that he was probably making a big mistake in the family dynamic to go into dad and saying, you know what those 4 boys are doing behind their back is probably not a good thing. And those brothers probably had a legitimate reason to not like him. Okay? It goes on and says, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. Okay, I'm about to say, we're all adults here. I'm about to say something. Oh, no, we're not all adults. Oops, I'm not going to say anything rude. It's just weird. In the Jewish mythological story, you can read it if you ever want to read any rabbinical writings about, because they talk about this story a lot, but they've come to feel, now don't blame me for what I'm about to tell you, but the Jews in their mythological version of this, which is wider and has a lot more details that are not in the text, they still teach this, that Joseph's father, Jacob, in his great mourning for his lost wife, Rachel, who's the one that he worked for all those years, that when Joseph was a little boy, he would dress him up in, because Rachel died in childbirth with Benjamin, the youngest child. And they say that he would dress Joseph up in women's robes and curl his hair and paint his eyes because he looked so much like his mother. Now, that's creepy, I know, and it's weird. But they say that's also why he gave him the coat. And it's also why, and this is why they believe this. Later in the story, if you know how the story goes, Joseph ends up ruling the world. And he's not that far from where his family was. And not once does he ever contact his family. He could have sent the entire Egyptian army to get them and bring them to safety in a famine. He could have done all kinds of things to save his family, and he did nothing. And the Jews say that the reason that he didn't was because his dad treated him so weirdly as a boy. Now, I don't know if that's true, but if you have any Jewish friends, they might bring that up, okay? Just letting you know, because this is part of the way they talk about the story. But I do have to talk about the robe. Okay, buckle up. First off, in the original Hebrew, it does not say he had a coat of many colors. The Hebrew says it's a very peculiar statement, and if you listen to the guys in the Bible Project, they skip right over this. They don't talk about it because what it says is he had a coat, a robe with long sleeves. He was given a robe with long sleeves. Now, there's a bunch of stuff about this. First off, it would have been made out of a satin or silky material. It would have been very expensive and really hard to make, the long sleeves in particular. It would have been a sign that you were never expected to do any labor. Does this make sense? Okay. It's a coat or a robe with long sleeves. That's in the Hebrew. 2nd century BC, the ruler of Rome, essentially, but the government of the time wanted the Jewish scholars to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Are you following me? This is a long time after the story was written. We're 200 years before Jesus. 70 Jewish scholars, this is the story, translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. It is called the Septuagint. You might hear that word sometime. It is the Bible that Jesus' people would have used. It is the primary text of the time, the Septuagint. When the scholars got to this story, almost all of the gods of Egypt, the statues, particularly the life-size statues of the gods of Egypt, because these scholars were all living in Alexandria, Egypt, they would put robes with long sleeves on their idols. Okay? they covered them with these expensive, fabulous satin robes with long sleeves. And those scholars decided that they did not want to equate what happened to Joseph with the gods of Egypt. You following me? Is everybody with me on this? And so they changed the text to read a coat with many colors because it was not something that anybody would have thought of as something that connected Joseph to the gods of Egypt. And so Joseph did not have a technicolor dream coat. He had a robe with long sleeves. Now, I think the story's cooler with multicolor, because I did look up the picture of the original Jesus, or no, it's Joseph in his technicolor raincoat, technicolor dream coat. And it's as colorful and fabulous looking and wild, and I can't wait to see what they come up with this production. But it was probably one color. But the long sleeves is what made all of his brothers furious, because it said his dad favored him so much that this boy doesn't have to do any work. Okay? That's just sorry, it's just true. It's just true. And nobody talks about it because it ruins the story. You know, because everybody talks about the many-colored coat. But the thing is more important. It's not that he just got a fancy coat. He got a coat that says he was one of the few who didn't have to go out and do anything anymore, because he'd been what? He'd been an assistant to the other brothers, and now he's got this coat. In fact, as the story goes on, his dad sends him out to find all these brothers, but he's not out there working with them anymore. Why? Because he's got a coat with long sleeves. Now, I'm just going to say this about it. Anytime that you have a child in a family who is favored, you got trouble. You got trouble. I don't know if any of you grew up in a family where you have a sibling who was clearly more important to dad or mom than you were. Interestingly, in my family, all three of us thought the other ones were most favored. But this is a problem. And this story shows us the difficulty that comes when this happens. This action on Jacob's part was really, it caused tons of trouble. In fact, how much more time do I have? I don't know, I've been going on. I can keep talking? I'm fine, okay. I'm just going to read you. Now, this is long. I'm going to read the next hunk. Okay, wow. She got it all, wow. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest. The word hated there means exactly that. Hated. Can you imagine dinner at that house? They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him even more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in a field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed down to mine. Now, I'm just saying, if you have that dream, don't tell anybody, okay? By the way, he's going to have two dreams. This is the first one. They thought of the universe as being two spaces, heaven and earth. And what just happened was that all things on earth just bowed down to Joseph. Not just his family, but all things. That's what they would have thought. And his brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. And soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I have another dream, he said. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars. 11 is an important number because guess how many brothers there are? 11. Bowed down before me. This time he told his dream to his father as well as to his brothers, but his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you? While his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. Now, just to let you know this is kind of important to keep in mind broadly. Ancient people, and this is true all the way through the Old Testament, even into about 400 or 500 years of the post-Jesus time, they did not separate dreams from reality. Their thoughts about the way dreams worked in our heads were that they were somehow connected to the real world. That we don't have any way to think like that. But I believe this is why in the Bible, we have so many people have dreams and they act on them. Have you ever noticed that? People are always having dreams in the Bible and something comes out of it. And they want to, if you have a dream and you don't understand it, you got to find somebody who can explain it because it has some connection to the real world. I had a dream last night that I told my wife about this morning and we both laughed, and I've already forgotten what it was because it doesn't matter. Because we don't think dreams are real. And since we don't think dreams are real, God doesn't send us dreams to tell us what's going on. They thought dreams were absolutely an important part of the universe, or just as important as a conversation you have with somebody. And so God sends them dreams because their culture worked that way. And in these dreams, Joseph is saying, I'm not only going to rule over you guys, but I'm going to rule over what? The earth, the first dream, and the heavens in the second. In other words, in his two dreams, he had just learned somehow from somewhere that he was going to rule what? Everything. No wonder they hated him. No wonder they hated him. One other thing. Anytime that God does two things in a story or says two things that are almost exactly the same in some place in the Bible, pay attention, because when he says two things that are kind of the same, God's in it somehow, and you need to pay attention to that. And if he does three things, it's for real. But if it's two, and you'll notice that if you read through the scripture, you'll notice that something happens, and then a little bit later, something similar to it happens, and you got to go, those are really kind of the same. Or Jesus says the same thing twice. And you go, we better pay attention to that, okay? But here he has two dreams. The Jews have learned from that they needed to pay attention to it. Why? Because there's something of God in the multiplication of the same story. All right? But to his brothers, this was terrible. It's terrible. I do think this, that I'm not going to, I can't read the whole rest of the story to you. It is interesting, though, that the brothers get really mad about these dreams, and then they plot to kill him. And the plot to kill him is actually the means that God works through to bring about the salvation that he has at the end. And this happens often in the Bible. I actually had a list in my notes. Let's see. Moses in the bulrushes. They wanted to kill all of the little children, and they put Moses in the bulrushes, and he ends up what? Growing up in the king's house, and then the Jews get saved. Or Esther. They plan to kill all the Jews, but Esther somehow in the process ends up in this horrible process of bringing girls in every night for the king and all that, and she ends up there, and this is a thing that's working to be bad for people, and it ends up what? Saving the Jews. It's the same with the Pharisees and their plots against Jesus make it possible for him to save the world. These things happen in the Bible all the time, and that's what's going to happen in this story. They're going to plot. Well, here, I don't have time to read it, but I'll read you what I read. Joseph comes, he's sent out by his dad to find out where they are, because they lived in, I don't need to talk about that, but this system of where they lived was that they had made arrangements with other nations so they could bring their herds through, and they were migratory. I don't even want to get into the technical things about it, but they didn't have a home per se. They just made deals with people who did have towns so they could bring their herds through, and they paid them for that right, and so they could be anywhere because they'd make all kinds of deals. And so he sends Joseph out to find his brothers. He finds them. they see him coming. They go, here comes that dreamer. They've got a plot. They're going to kill him. They're going to kill him, and they're going to... Now, the word that they're going to throw him down into is either a cistern or a pit. We don't know which one it is. I don't know what they're going to say in the musical. A cistern, we know, was built in a certain way that it was hidden by the way that they would dig the cistern. They would fill it with rainwater mostly, and then they would put the rocks on the top so that nobody would know that it was there. And if they threw him down a cistern, it might add water in it, but it doesn't seem to. It could have been a dry time. If it was just a pit, we don't know why they would have dug the pit, maybe to catch wild animals or something. But they were going to kill him and throw him down in there, and they're going to take his robe, kill an animal. Well, originally they were going to kill him. They're going to bloody it all up and take it back to their dad and say that a wild animal ate him. But Reuben gets them to change their mind. They throw him in the hole, and he was going to come back later. He says, don't shed blood. And that's an important detail, because you remember Cain and Abel? Their whole thing is about shedding blood. Well, this is the same thing. The end result is that rather than killing him, they sell him to some Ishmaelite migratory traders, and then they take his fancy coat and they take it back to their dad and say, well, we found this robe all bloodied up. He must have gotten killed by a wild animal. Jacob falls apart. There are two or three big reasons. He just falls out. I don't know if you know this, but when his favorite wife died and when his other wife died, it was almost like a non-event. He was, well, okay. But when Joseph dies, it says he mourned on and on and on and on, which probably made the brothers mad that he was so mourning. But here's the reason why, because he would have thought that the reason that God had punished him, and his father recognized it immediately, said, yes, it is my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him. Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes and dressed himself in burlap, and he mourned deeply for his son for a long time, and his family all tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. I will go to my grave mourning for my son, he would say, and then he would weep. Okay, couple of things. One of the most important things in that culture was you bury your dead. When you don't get to bury your dead, then it is a terrible affront to the whole family. You have done something horrible by not burying your dead. And this would have upset him tremendously that his favorite son did not have a grave. And there's a lot of that still that goes on in the Middle East now. I don't know if you noticed, but the Muslims, they have to bury them within 24 hours as fast as they can. In fact, right now when the Jews go in and they take bodies out with what they're doing in Gaza, part of the reason is an affront to the Muslim sensibilities, just to hold on to the body for a while. It's just... And secondly, he probably thought either Joseph had committed some terrible sin, or that he had, because this is they felt that God's judgment on sin showed itself up in death that came either by a sword, by famine, by pestilence, or by being torn apart by wild animals. Those were the four things that they considered to be the terrible judgment of God on sin in a family. And so he's thinking, somebody sinned here, and this is why he's so upset. And he could have thought, because in their eyes, sin went from all generations. If you sin as a dad, it might show up on your grandchildren. And that's still true in Jesus' day. They're still thinking that sin was responsible through all generations. So he's really upset. Now, let me see if I should wrap this up, shouldn't I? Yeah, I should wrap it up. My notes say I'm going to stop here. Okay, I'm going to tell you what the story tells the Jews, okay? tells you this, because we know what happens in the end. He ends up what? He gets hauled off, and all kinds of terrible things happen to him, and he's in jail, and he ends up running the world. And what this tells what told the Jews, and remember, the first readers were in the wilderness, wandering from place to place after being released from slavery with no home, having to eat manna every day, and thinking things were terrible, and they're thinking that, and this story tells them what? It tells them that often, even when the most difficult things happen, anything is still redeemable. Jews now look at this story and they say the ultimate result of this story is their own existence. They exist because this story happened. And that even though the Jews were wandering in the wilderness when they first got the story, and even though there was a whole bunch of Jews who had to go into exile later into Babylon, that there's a great possibility, just like with Joseph, if we trust him and stay honest to him and do the right things, no matter how hard it is, God is still present and he's still working to redeem us in the end. That's where this story takes us. Like we don't have the long view. God is always working for the long view. No place in this story does it ever say that it was Joseph's ethical life that made all of this good happen in the end. It always says God did this. And that's the thing that the Jews and we should hang on to. We are responsible to be obedient to what we know is to be true, but we are just actors in a bigger play that somehow has in its end the redemption of possibly everybody. I don't know. This is what this story says. Now I just want to, do I have 2 minutes? Okay. God planned these things. He planned that Jacob's family would move to Egypt, that the whole nation, that family would be saved from famine. He planned that Israel would be fruitful and multiply as a nation in Egypt. Oh, you put that up. And that Israel would be, you're the best. They'd become slaves, but then they were slaves, but they left. You know, the last thing it says about before they left, it says, and they plundered the Egyptians. They left with enough stuff in the backs of their camels to build the tabernacle. They had it all in pouches and stuff because they'd plundered the Egyptians. And then that's what he decided for them, and this is what he did. He sent dreams to people. All sorts of people. He enabled Joseph to interpret the dreams. He brought famine to a world that accentuated Joseph's wisdom, and he led the Jews out of slavery. This is what he did. So, hey, this wouldn't have happened if Joseph had not been a smart, alecky little teenager who badmouthed his brothers to his dad and then ended up wearing a fancy robe and down in a pit, and he got sold as a slave. I'm just saying. This just tells us. It tells us that we just sometimes don't know what's going on, but God is always present, even when the circumstances seem dire. Now, I got 30 seconds. I'm just going to tell you this, and this is in the notes. The Muslims have this same, it's the only narrative in the Quran, all right? And I'm just going to tell you, it's really different in little details. And the little details make a huge difference. I don't know if any of you have Muslim neighbors. I have a bunch of Muslim neighbors now all of a sudden, right on a cherry tree. And that we can talk about the stuff that's the same. We say, we have the story of Joseph. And they say, we have the story of Joseph. But their story, and I've put all the differences in the app notes, their story ends up saying that you are given permission to tell God that you're righteous, and he's got to live with it. Joseph makes all the right decisions, and he ends up self-righteously commanding God himself to take care of him, and God is obligated to him. That's the whole ethos of Islam, in that they live in a certain way and obligate God to them. This story is exactly the opposite. You do the right things and everything goes bad. And God in his graciousness saves us. They are two different stories. So if you ever or have a conversation with a neighbor or something about it, you might want to look at those differences. I will say one other thing, and then I'll leave you with this. When in the Quran, when Joseph is accused of attacking trying to rape the wife of the person who, it's a different person in that story, but he's accused of trying to rape this woman. She says, because she's been trying to get him, she says, okay, I'm going to prove to you that I can't be blamed for this. And they take Joseph into a space where a whole bunch of women are chopping vegetables. And he is so beautiful that they start chopping their hands. And they just lose control because he is so beautiful they can't control themselves. Thus, women in Muslim countries have to cover themselves totally because you all are incapable of functioning in the presence of a beautiful man. That's where that stuff comes from. It's a different story, guys. It's a different story. So I just want you to know that little bit of truth, okay? So if you go see it, I hope you have a great time. I hope it's as good as Amy keeps telling us it is. And thanks for giving me all this time and listening to me for so long. And I don't know that I'll see you again, but maybe. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Tim. And you guys, I think, do you still have any time to answer questions if any group has questions?
Yeah,
He's available.
I don't have anything till noon. So.
Okay, so if your group wants to talk with Tim a little bit more about something, he's available and graciously is willing to do that. So you can decide amongst yourselves. Thank you. Enjoy your small group time.